A security camera captures everything. When Amanda Wellington slaps a simple housewife over a spilled coffee, she thinks her husband's money will make it disappear. But that housewife is about to inherit a fortune, and Amanda's husband will be forced to choose between his cruel wife and a $150 million business deal. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of karma and consequences, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because stories like this remind us that no amount of money can buy class or protect you from your own actions. Now let's see how one slap cost a family everything. It was a Saturday morning in the quiet suburb of Riverside, and the community center was buzzing with its usual weekend energy. The church had organized a charity bake sale, and volunteers were setting up tables filled with homemade cookies, pies, and cakes. Among those volunteers was Rachel Morgan, a 32-year-old woman whose life revolved around her family, her church, and her community. Rachel was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who always brought extra food to potlucks, and who never said no when someone needed help. She wore a simple floral dress that morning, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and flowers still dusted on her sleeve from the morning's baking. Rachel had spent the previous night making 3 chocolate cakes for the sale, staying up late after putting her 2 children to bed. Her husband Michael worked long hours as an accountant at a small firm downtown, and money was always tight in their household. But Rachel never complained. She found richness in the small moments, reading bedtime stories to her 6-year-old daughter, helping her 8-year-old son with his math homework, and volunteering wherever she could make a difference. That morning, Rachel was carefully carrying a stack of cake boxes from her car to the setup tables. The boxes were stacked high, and she had to peek around them to see where she was going. She navigated through the community center's hallway, focused on not dropping the precious cargo that represented hours of her work. What Rachel didn't know was that her life was about to change in the most unexpected and dramatic way possible. At that exact moment, Amanda Wellington was walking through the same hallway. Amanda was 42 years old, but she looked younger thanks to expensive treatments and procedures that her husband's money could easily afford. She wore a cream-colored designer dress that cost more than Rachel's monthly grocery budget, carried a handbag that could have paid Rachel's mortgage for 3 months, and wore sunglasses indoors because she thought it made her look important. Amanda was at the community center for a social club meeting, a gathering of wealthy women who met weekly to plan galas and fundraisers where they could show off their wealth while pretending to care about charity. Amanda was distracted, scrolling through her phone and sipping an overpriced vanilla latte when Rachel turned the corner. The collision was gentle, barely a bump, but it was enough. Amanda's latte tilted, and coffee splashed across the front of her expensive dress. The designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a thud. Rachel's cake boxes wobbled dangerously, but she managed to steady them without dropping a single one. What happened next would be captured on the community center's security camera and would soon be viewed by millions of people. Rachel immediately began apologizing, her voice filled with genuine concern and embarrassment. She set down the cake boxes and reached for napkins, offering to help clean the spill, asking if Amanda was okay, her words tumbling out in a rush of sincere remorse. But Amanda wasn't interested in apologies or accidents or understanding. Amanda's face twisted with rage. She looked at Rachel with pure contempt, the kind of look that says, "You are beneath me. You are nothing. You don't deserve to breathe the same air as me." And then she started yelling. Her voice echoed through the hallway as she berated Rachel, calling her clumsy, stupid, worthless. She demanded to know who Rachel thought she was, bumping into her betters. She said that people like Rachel should stay home where they couldn't cause problems for important people. Other volunteers and community center visitors began to gather, watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort. Rachel stood there, her face flushed with humiliation, tears beginning to form in her eyes. She apologized again and again, her voice small and shaking. She offered to pay for the dress cleaning, even though she had no idea how she would afford it. But Amanda wasn't finished. In fact, she was just getting started. Amanda pulled out her phone and began filming, narrating the scene as if she were documenting some grave injustice done to her. And then it happened. Amanda raised her hand and slapped Rachel hard across the face. The sound cracked through the hallway like a gunshot. Rachel's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her burning cheek, shock and pain written across her features. The gathered crowd gasped. Someone shouted at Amanda to stop. But Amanda just smiled, a cold, satisfied smile. She had put this nobody in her place. She had shown everyone what happens when you inconvenience Amanda Wellington. Amanda stopped filming, looked at Rachel one last time with utter disdain, and walked away, her heels clicking on the tile floor. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, then quietly picked up her cake boxes with trembling hands and continued to the bake sale table. She didn't make a scene. She didn't scream or fight back. She simply carried on with her volunteer work, though tears streamed silently down her face the entire time. What Amanda didn't realize was that the community center's security cameras had captured everything. And what Amanda definitely didn't know was that her perfectly ordered, privileged life was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular way imaginable within hours. Amanda had posted her edited version of the video on social media. In her version, Rachel was the aggressor, the clumsy fool who had ruined her dress and then refused to take responsibility. Amanda's caption read, "When entitled people think they can just bump into you and walk away, sometimes you have to teach them manners." Her wealthy friends commented with support, with laughing emojis, with messages saying Amanda was right to stand up for herself. But then someone from the community center, appalled by what they had witnessed, released the full security footage. This version showed everything. It showed Rachel carefully navigating with the cake boxes. It showed Amanda distracted on her phone. It showed the gentle, accidental bump. It showed Rachel's immediate and sincere apologies. And it showed Amanda's cruel, vicious response culminating in that violent slap of a woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. The video spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up, then regional news, then national news. People were outraged. They flooded Amanda's social media with comments calling out her behavior, her cruelty, her abuse of someone who couldn't fight back. The hashtag Justice for Rachel began trending. Reporters tried to interview Amanda, but she refused, dismissing the entire thing as an overreaction by people who didn't understand how the world really worked. Christopher Wellington, Amanda's husband, watched all of this unfold with growing concern. Christopher was 50 years old, a self-made millionaire who had built a $300 million real estate empire from nothing. He had grown up poor, worked construction jobs to pay for college, and slowly built his business through hard work and smart decisions. Somewhere along the way, he had married Amanda, a woman whose beauty had blinded him to her character flaws. Now, 20 years into their marriage, he was finally seeing his wife clearly, and he didn't like what he saw. Christopher tried to talk to Amanda about the situation. He suggested she apologize, make a public statement, donate to charity, do something to fix the damage. But Amanda refused. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. Rachel was nobody. The video would be forgotten in a week, and Christopher's money would protect them from any real consequences. Just like it always had, Amanda had spent 2 decades insulated from accountability by wealth and privilege. And she saw no reason why this time would be any different. But this time was different, very different. Because while Amanda was dismissing the entire incident and Christopher was worrying about their public image, Rachel Morgan's life was changing in ways that nobody could have predicted. 3 days after the slap, Rachel received a phone call from an attorney in Boston. The man on the line introduced himself as Gerald Patterson, a state attorney for the late Thomas Morgan. That name meant something to Rachel. Thomas was her uncle, her father's older brother, but Rachel barely knew Thomas. He had left the family 30 years ago after some kind of dispute, moved across the country, and never looked back. Rachel had met him perhaps twice in her entire life, both times when she was a small child. She knew almost nothing about him except that he existed somewhere out there in the world. Gerald Patterson informed Rachel that Thomas had passed away 2 weeks earlier. And then he told her something that made her sit down hard on her kitchen chair, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Thomas Morgan had left Rachel everything, his entire estate, and that estate was worth $180 million. Rachel couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The number was so large it didn't seem real. Michael came home from work to find his wife sitting at the kitchen table in a daze, the attorney's business card clutched in her hand. When she told him, he thought she was joking. Then he thought she had been scammed. It took 3 more phone calls with the attorney, a video conference, and piles of legal documents before they truly believed it was real. Thomas Morgan, the uncle Rachel barely remembered, had been a tech investor in the early days of Silicon Valley. He had gotten in on the ground floor with several companies that became massive successes. He had lived simply, never married, never had children, and apparently never forgot about his brother's little girl. His will was simple. Everything went to Rachel, with one condition: she had to take an active role in the business decisions of the companies where Thomas held controlling shares. He didn't want his legacy to be managed by distant attorneys and accountants. He wanted family involved. Among those companies was Harrison Property Group, one of the largest commercial real estate investment firms on the East Coast. Thomas had been a silent partner, owning 40% of the company, enough to have final approval on any major business decisions. And now that power belonged to Rachel, a housewife from Riverside who spent her days carpooling kids and baking cookies. The irony of what was about to happen was almost too perfect to be believed, because at that exact moment, Christopher Wellington was in the final stages of negotiating the biggest deal of his career. He was planning a merger with Harrison Property Group, a deal that would combine resources, expand both companies exponentially, and net Christopher personally about $150 million. The contracts were drafted. The meetings were scheduled. All that remained was final approval from Harrison Property Group's controlling shareholder. Christopher had no idea that the controlling shareholder was now Rachel Morgan, the simple housewife his wife had slapped, the woman whose humiliation had been broadcast to millions, the person who now held his entire future in her hands. Rachel's first board meeting at Harrison Property Group was scheduled for 2 weeks after she received the news of her inheritance. Those 2 weeks were a whirlwind of lawyers, financial advisors, crash courses in business terminology, and overwhelming amounts of information. Rachel was terrified. She had never even worked in an office, and now she was walking into a boardroom of powerful executives who would be looking to her for decisions worth millions of dollars. The morning of the meeting, Rachel stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to wear. She settled on a simple navy dress, nothing fancy, paired with the nicest shoes she owned. Michael drove her to the Harrison Property Group headquarters in the city, squeezing her hand before she got out of the car and telling her she could do this. Rachel took a deep breath and walked into the building. The boardroom was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a massive oak table, leather chairs and screens on every wall displaying charts and graphs. Rachel took her seat, introduced herself quietly to the other board members, and tried not to look as nervous as she felt. The meeting began with various presentations and reports. Rachel listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions when she didn't understand something. And then Christopher Wellington walked in. He didn't notice Rachel at first. He was focused on his presentation materials, confident and relaxed because this deal was essentially done. He just needed to go through the motions of presenting his proposal, and then he would walk out $150 million richer. Christopher stepped to the front of the room, greeted the board with easy charm, and launched into his presentation about the merger benefits, the projected growth, the strategic advantages. Halfway through his presentation, Christopher's eyes swept across the board members, a practiced gesture of engagement, and then his gaze landed on Rachel. He froze mid-sentence. His face went pale. The clicker in his hand dropped to the table with a clatter. Because sitting there, in the controlling shareholder's seat, wearing a simple navy dress and watching him with calm, steady eyes, was the woman his wife had slapped 2 weeks ago. The woman whose humiliation had been viewed by millions. The woman whose face had haunted Christopher's guilty conscience ever since he saw that security footage. Christopher somehow managed to finish his presentation, though his confidence had evaporated. When he finished, Rachel spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet but clear. She thanked him for his presentation. She said she needed time to review everything carefully with her advisors. She asked several pointed, intelligent questions that made it clear she understood exactly what was at stake. And then she told him they would be in touch within the week with a decision. Christopher left that boardroom knowing his entire future was now in the hands of a woman his wife had assaulted. He drove home in silence, his mind racing through scenarios and consequences. When he walked through the door of his mansion, Amanda was on the couch scrolling through her phone, unbothered and unconcerned about anything beyond her own small world. Christopher told her what had happened. He explained who Rachel Morgan really was, what she now controlled, and what that meant for their future. He expected shock, maybe fear, perhaps regret. What he got instead was laughter. Amanda actually laughed. She told Christopher he was worrying over nothing. Rachel was just a simple housewife who got lucky. She would sign whatever paperwork was put in front of her because people like her didn't have the intelligence or confidence to do anything else. And if Rachel did somehow try to cause problems, well, Christopher could just offer her more money. Everyone had a price. Christopher begged Amanda to reconsider. He asked her to call Rachel, to apologize, to make this right before it was too late. Amanda refused absolutely. She would not humiliate herself by apologizing to someone so far beneath her social standing. She told Christopher that if his business deal was so fragile that it could be destroyed by one unremarkable woman, then maybe he wasn't the brilliant businessman everyone thought he was. And besides, Amanda added with cruel certainty, she had her own money in the prenuptial agreement. If Christopher's deal fell apart, it would be his problem, not hers. That night, Christopher barely slept. He kept thinking about the look in Rachel's eyes during that board meeting. It wasn't anger or hatred or even triumph. It was something more unnerving. It was calm evaluation, as if she were weighing him on a scale and deciding what he was worth. Rachel, meanwhile, spent that week in constant meetings with financial advisors and lawyers. They showed her the power she held. The Wellington deal could proceed, or it could be canceled with a single signature. Harrison Property Group didn't need the merger. It was financially stable, with or without Christopher Wellington. The decision was entirely Rachel's to make based on whatever criteria she chose. Rachel thought about revenge. She thought about how satisfying it would be to destroy Amanda's comfortable life the way Amanda had tried to destroy her dignity. She thought about the slap, the humiliation, the tears, the mocking video. But she also thought about who she wanted to be. Rachel had been raised to believe that how you treat others matters, that cruelty should not be met with cruelty, that you should be better than those who hurt you. On the 5th day after that board meeting, Rachel called Christopher Wellington directly. She asked for a private meeting, just the two of them, no lawyers or advisors. Christopher agreed immediately, desperate for any opportunity to save his deal. They met at a quiet coffee shop far from both their neighborhoods, a neutral space where they could talk honestly. Rachel looked across the table at this millionaire, this powerful businessman who had built an empire but who now needed something from her. She told him directly that she would approve the merger, but she had conditions. First, Amanda had to apologize in person, face to face, with no cameras and no audience. Second, Amanda had to donate $50,000 to a charity supporting victims of assault and abuse. If Amanda agreed to these terms, the deal would move forward. If she refused, Rachel would cancel everything. Christopher sat back in his chair, processing the terms. He had expected her to ask for millions for herself. He had expected her to demand Amanda's public humiliation. Instead, Rachel was asking for dignity and accountability, for Amanda to own what she had done and make amends. The terms were more than fair. They were merciful. Christopher knew immediately that Amanda would never agree. He went home and presented Rachel's conditions to his wife. Amanda's response was exactly what he feared. She refused completely and absolutely. She would rather lose everything than apologize to that woman. She told Christopher that if he even considered accepting those terms, he was weak and pathetic. She said that she had married a man with power, not a man who bowed to nobodies. Christopher could either stand by his wife and find another deal, or he could show himself to be the spineless coward she was beginning to suspect he really was. Christopher Wellington had spent 20 years in a marriage where he confused beauty for character and wealth for happiness. He had ignored red flags, excused bad behavior, and enabled his wife's cruelty by protecting her from consequences. But standing in his oversized living room, listening to Amanda's venomous refusal to show even the smallest amount of decency, Christopher finally saw his marriage clearly, and he made a choice. He called Rachel the next morning. He told her that he would sign a personal apology letter, taking responsibility for not addressing his wife's behavior sooner. He would accept a reduced merger deal. $100 million instead of $150 million, as a penalty for his family's actions, and he would file for divorce from Amanda. Rachel was surprised by Christopher's decision, but she saw the exhaustion and resignation in his voice. She agreed to the modified terms. The merger moved forward. Christopher's business survived, though his profit was significantly reduced, and he filed for divorce that same week. Amanda Wellington was genuinely shocked. She had been so certain that Christopher would choose her, that his fear of losing everything would make him side with his wife against the world. Instead, she found herself served with divorce papers and facing the reality that her prenuptial agreement, which she had once thought so generous, left her with only a modest settlement, nothing close to the lifestyle she had become accustomed to living. The social circle that had once surrounded Amanda disappeared almost overnight. Wealthy friends distanced themselves from the scandal. Country club memberships were quietly revoked. Invitations to galas and fundraisers stopped arriving. Amanda's social media following, which had once hung on her every post, turned against her completely. She was forced to move from the mansion to a regular apartment. She had to get an actual job for the first time in 20 years. The world she had built on her husband's money and her own cruelty crumbled around her. 6 months later, Rachel Morgan's life had transformed completely, but not in the ways people might expect. Yes, she lived in a nicer house now, and yes, money was no longer a constant worry, but Rachel hadn't changed who she fundamentally was. She still volunteered at church. She still carpooled for her kids. She still baked cookies for bake sales. She had used her inheritance to establish a foundation supporting victims of assault and abuse, with special programs for people who felt powerless against those with wealth and privilege. Christopher Wellington, meanwhile, was rebuilding his life and his reputation. He had donated substantial amounts to Rachel's foundation. He had publicly acknowledged his failure to address his wife's behavior. He and Rachel had developed a mutual respect, two people who had both been tested by circumstance and had chosen to respond with integrity rather than revenge. Amanda was spotted working at a boutique downtown, a regular job with regular hours and no special treatment. The experience was humbling her in ways that nothing else ever had. Whether she would learn from it remained to be seen. And Rachel? Rachel Morgan, the simple housewife who had been slapped and humiliated, who could have destroyed lives in revenge but chose mercy instead, continued living her life with the same grace and kindness that had defined her before the inheritance. Because money and power hadn't changed Rachel's character, it had simply revealed it. And in the end, that revelation of character had made all the difference. Sometimes the universe doesn't just balance the scales, it tips them toward justice. And sometimes the person you least expect to have power turns out to be the most powerful person in the room. Not because of money or status or connections, but because of something far more valuable, the strength to choose dignity over revenge, mercy over cruelty, and character over everything else. Amanda Wellington learned the hardest way possible that your actions define you, not your bank account. If this story reminded you that karma is real and character matters, smash that like button and share this video. Drop a comment telling us, would you have handled this the same way Rachel did, or would you have walked away completely? Subscribe for more incredible stories where justice prevails. Remember, treat people with respect because you never know who they might become. See you in the next one.